It's been a minute. I got a chance to paint 2 models from Games Workshop from the new Dawnbringer Crusade boxes. Specifically, I painted the Harbinger of Decay and the Rabaraza. This is what they look like, and I'm going to show you exactly how I achieved these results. Looking at the Harbinger of Decay, this is the Nurgle model. He's mostly tactical rock, which is an entirely optional thing. I'm actually going to have him off of the rock for most of this video, and you'll see how I touch it later. They do an exquisite job of hiding the joins and connections beneath all the details. Here a join line is hidden underneath the rope. Mostly assembled now, I'm going to leave his head off and the base off so I can paint those parts separately later. And before you ask, there's 2 options for this model. One is a bell and the other one is a scythe. I built the model before I saw the rules for it, and right now rules is written, the profile for this thing is so much worse than the other one, it's silly. That being said, painting a bell is fun and it's a very Nurgle thing, so that's what we're doing. A miniature painter's most valuable commodity is not their talent, it's their time. In respect for that, I like to work on multiple models at the same time. That way I'm saving myself the setup costs for my workspace, my airbrush, all of the things that I need. I'm gonna try not to jump around too much, but I will be working on both models at the same time, so it's a little bit of a juggle show. Didn't know you signed up for that, did you? I primed both models black and then zapped them from above with a light gray. This is called a zenithal undercoat. You can do this with a rattle can or an airbrush, or you can even dry brush it if you're an animal living in a cave. I'm just kidding about that. I don't know a single animal that dry brushes anything. The reason why I do this is because it reveals details to the mini, it informs where I should paint the shadows, and it saves a bunch of time with layering if I'm using a glaze paint like speed paints or contrast. Painting white with an airbrush is a pain in the ass, so this is what I do to clear it out. I squirt the paint through with the spray bottle, and then I rinse it with a little bit of Windex, and then I put some flow improver in it and I let it rest. This keeps the inside of the airbrush kind of wet. It dries slower than water anyways, and that means that when I go to throw paint in it the next time, it's not going to instantly bind up on the inside of the airbrush. If you want to know more about airbrushing, let me know and I'll make a video about it. This is where I start to speed up the video footage because I'm just adding speed paint to block in the colors. Green for the skin, red for the robes, barbarian flesh for the horsey, and plague bearer flesh for the rider's robes. I'm trying not to get this paint onto any of the areas that don't have that color. Basically, I look at the way the model is shaped and I try to determine what material it is, and that material will inform what color I choose for it. I know that these creatures that belong to Nurgle at one point were just regular people. I wanted this guy to represent some kind of hero, maybe a majestic steed, so I thought I would use blue for the mane. Now right away you're seeing me break this rule because I'm painting over the edge of the shield, which is clearly a different material. It's like there's wood on the shield itself, but the edge is going to be metal. But I'm painting it brown all the same, and I think that's going to make a good base undercoat for the metallic paints I'm going to use to paint the borders. Time for highlighting. After putting a bone color on this giant skull that the grot wears, I'm going to put a very gentle dry brush of like a very pale tan color over him. This is going to create the illusion of edge highlighting without actually doing the work. I find it interesting to note that a pale tan color can act as a effective highlight for things that are brown, green, red, and purple. It's weird that you can find a totally common color that you think would fit in the brown spectrum, but actually goes over a lot of other colors really nicely. I'm going to be abusing that a lot in this video. The specific paints I chose for this is called Kislev Flesh, and you can see me using it here to bring out highlights on the goblin's face. I'm still getting used to using the Army Painter speed paints. I'm still using the Generation 1 speed paints, and I'm really impressed with this Fire Giant Orange. It just went on one coat, and its highlights sell really well. You can see it later when it's dry. Leaning into the Plague Bearer flesh tones for the robe and the hat, I'm going to use that Kislev Flesh to highlight this color too. But moving into the horse's mane, I am going to use a lighter blue and then a white. Still dry brushing for the highlights here because this model is so detail dense, I don't need to do the work. They already put the work in for me. I'm always amused by speed paints and contrast paints because they're supposed to be faster than using a layer paint, but it's warm on my office and regular layer paints dry really quickly. I end up having to wait around for my contrast paints to dry. Back to our Gobbo friend, I'm going to start filling in details like the weapon handles, and to do this I'm just going to use a detail brush and just be careful. When picking out details like this, precision is pretty important in the way that you don't want to paint outside of the material that you're trying to get color onto, but you don't really need to be that specific. I find that little dots are pretty effective in selling the shape of the thing. I like to paint details like this with a light gray or a white because the coverage is going to be so good every time. I don't need to spend a lot of time layering a different kind of yellow on a rope. So I'm going to go and paint this after the fact with a glazed medium of some kind. In this case, I'm using contrast paints again in yellow. Disaster! I forgot to scrape a mold line off the tooth of this skull thingy. I'm going to scrape it down, prime it with some brush on paint, and then just paint right over with the gold, and then use some ink wash to fix it. It's already looking better. Time for some mushrooms. Again with the dots. This time a new, brighter dot goes on top of the old dots. I just like dots. My recipe for all things toothy and bone is generally a light brown and then a, you guessed it, dot of Heaslip flesh on the top of it. And that's what we're doing here with the teeth. This is one of the first times I used ink wash on these minis. I usually use that stuff like a weapon, but I don't feel like I needed it that much this time. Just a little bit of tonal shading is going to bring the color of that gold down a little bit, so I can come back with some dots and make a highlight. Even though this is the same gold color, it's brighter than the darker part underneath, so it's going to look like a highlight. Some white dots for the eyes on the big squig, and that's going to do it. I figured the detail's only going to be on the big guy. The little guys can have their eyes closed as they're flapping around, I guess. Now this is kind of a needless step. I'm doing some edge highlighting here with a brighter red. This is a character model, so I feel like it's okay to go a little extra for some contrast. And the lines on the edge of the fabric really makes it special. You may have noticed that I painted the metal parts of the weapon silver. Now I want to use a little bit of ink wash here. This is just standard Nuln Oil. We're going to let it go into the recesses and create a barrier between the brown, the green on the hand of the little guy, and the metal parts. Speaking of metallics, I cover all of the metal areas with black contrast paint. Metallic paints are going to stand off better from a dark background than from a light background. I want to bring the contrast up a bit on that shield and on the robes, so we're going to just use the same color of that pale tan that we used before, and we're going to do a light dry brush on it. I'm applying a shade here between the edges of materials, not to shade the wood necessarily, I mean that is achieved as well, but because I want to create a dark line between what is going to be bright metal on the rim and the dark wood on the interior. I couldn't pick a color for the horse barding, which is like the reins and the ropes and stuff. I like the way that the Agrax Earth shade looked on top of the undercoat, so I'm just gonna roll with that. Some people really hate the way that ink washes coffee stain miniatures, but I really love it. I like to pull it in the direction of where I want a shadow to be, and that creates this kind of synthesized occlusion shadow. It's a technique that we use in video games a lot, just to create a visual presence for something being in close proximity to something else. It has like a natural light blockage. Ooh, me using layer paints on the weapon haft? No way. Yeah, I'm using Morinphane Brown here. I want to add a layer paint and a shade and call it good. I'm tired of messing around with these newfangled contrast paints. Getting down to the home stretch here, I've put some purple and some dots onto the base of the gobbo, and now I'm going to add a little bit of notching and highlighting to the edges of the weapons he's got, and then I'll mount that skull on top and he might just be done. Closing the gap on some of the details in the Harbinger of Decay, doing a very light dry brush of a bright silver over the chainmail and other metal details. I want his armor to jump out a little bit, but just on the edges. Now carefully as possible, I'm going to put that silver onto the shield. From here I have a million clips of a dozen little details. The gold point on the end of his scabbard, the skulls on his horns, and the metal on the bell. But we're running out of time and I've kind of already shown you how to do those things. So let's just cut to the reveal. Before the reveal, I do want to tell you I did have a little bit of fun at the base here. I feel like these little elements make the miniature come alive. The old Harbinger of Decay had the word Nuln on his sign, and I just went with like Nuln 2 because that was a really lame take on where he would be going. Like, is he lost? What's the sign for? But my friend Jewel Knight Jess put together a fantastic Red Dwarf reference with hers, and I wish I had done something clever.